The whole town showed up that morning, not to welcome her, but to watch him fail. They lined the main street of Red Creek like crows on a fence wire, arms folded, eyes sharp, waiting for the woman who'd answered his advertisement to take one look at Gareth Hale's face and climb right back onto that stagecoach. 12 years they'd kept their distance from him. 12 years of lowered voices and crossed streets, and now every single one of them wanted a front row seat to his humiliation. What happened next, none of them would ever be able to explain, not even to themselves. Drop a comment with your city. Let's see how far this story travels. The advertisement ran in 3 newspapers. Gareth Hale had written and rewritten it 17 times over the course of a single winter evening, sitting at the rough-hewn table in his cabin with a stub of candle burning low and a cup of coffee gone cold beside his elbow. Every version he'd written before this one had been softer somehow, had tried to smooth over the truth the way a man spreads mud over a cracked wall, hoping nobody looks too close. But mud doesn't hold, and Gareth had learned a long time ago that the truth had a way of surfacing regardless of how deep you tried to bury it. So the final version said what it said. Frontier blacksmith, 39 years of age, seeks a wife of practical mind and steady temperament. I own my land and my tools outright. I am not a drinking man. I keep my word. I will tell you now what most men in my situation would wait until meeting to confess. I am badly scarred about the face and neck from a fire some years past. I do not write this seeking pity. I write it because a woman deserves to know what she is agreeing to before she makes any journey on my account. If this disqualifies me in your estimation, I understand it completely, and I hold no grievance. If you are a woman of honest character looking for an honest life, I am listening. He'd stared at those words for a long time after writing them. Then he folded the paper, walked to the post office before he could change his mind, and handed it across the counter to old Mercer without meeting the man's eyes. Mercer read it right there. Gareth heard the old man's breathing change. "You sure about this, Hale?" "Send it," Gareth said, and walked back out into the cold. Bombed. Red Creek, Wyoming territory, sat at the bottom of a long valley where the wind came down off the mountains like it had a personal grievance with everything below. It was a settlement of maybe 200 souls if you counted the outlying farms and the 2 families who lived in the foothills and only came to town for supplies and church. It had a general store, a livery, a saloon, a schoolhouse that doubled as a meeting hall, a small church with a lopsided steeple, and Gareth Hale's forge, which sat at the far end of the main street, slightly apart from everything else. The way a piece of furniture gets pushed to the corner of a room that nobody's quite decided what to do with. The forge was where Gareth spent the majority of his waking hours, and most of his sleeping ones too, if he was honest about it. He had a cabin behind it, 3 rooms, serviceable, clean, in the way that a man's place gets clean when there's no one else to see the mess but himself, and he stopped caring enough to maintain the pretense. He had a vegetable patch that he kept up more out of stubbornness than enthusiasm. He had a dog named Fletcher, a large, ugly, good-natured hound of indeterminate breeding who slept on the porch and periodically barked at nothing. He had a routine. He had work. He had, in all the ways that counted on paper, a life. What he didn't have was anyone who sat across the table from him at supper. The fire had happened 12 years ago, in the spring, when Gareth had been 27 years old and still the kind of man who didn't think twice about running toward a burning building instead of away from it. The Alderman farm had caught in the night. Dry spring, dry timber, a lantern knocked over in the barn, and then everything happening very fast. The Aldermans had livestock in that barn. Horses, a milk cow, 3 pigs. And the Alderman boy, 9 years old, who'd apparently snuck out there after dark for reasons a 9-year-old never fully explains, and who was found crouched in the far corner of the barn, paralyzed with terror, when Gareth came through the burning doorway. He'd gotten the boy out. He'd gotten all the animals out except 1 pig that had panicked and run the wrong direction, and Gareth had gone back in after it because that's the kind of stupid thing a 27-year-old man does when he's not thinking clearly, when his body is still moving on pure instinct and the alarm bells in his brain haven't quite caught up to the situation. He'd gotten the pig. He hadn't gotten out before part of the roof came down. What they pulled from the wreckage was alive, which the doctor said was somewhere between a miracle and an insult to probability. What they patched back together over the next several months was a man who would never again be the kind of man that people looked at without flinching. The burns covered the left side of his face entirely, cheek, jaw, temple, the corner of his eye, trailing down his neck and below his collar to his shoulder and part of his chest. The skin had healed the way burned skin heals, in ridges and pulls and discolorations that the body does its best to repair and never quite manages. He'd lost part of his left ear. His beard grew patchy on that side. His eye on that side still worked, which he was grateful for, though the skin around it was tight in a way that sometimes made that eye look wrong from certain angles, like something slightly off in a portrait. He was not a vain man. He had never been particularly vain, but there is a difference between being unconcerned with your appearance and learning, slowly and comprehensively, that your appearance concerns everyone else around you, whether you want it to or not. The first year after the fire, people had been kind, carefully kind, the kind of kindness that involves a great deal of not looking directly at something, but kind nonetheless. They brought food. They asked about his recovery. Mrs. Parson, who ran the general store with her husband, had patted his hand once and said he was very brave and meant it, and it had embarrassed them both equally. By the second year, the kindness had calcified into something else. Habit, maybe. Or discomfort that had been lived with long enough to harden into normalcy. People didn't bring food anymore. They traded with him because he was the only blacksmith within 30 miles, and a frontier settlement cannot function without ironwork. Horseshoes, hinges, plows, tools, all of it. So they came to the forge with their work and their coin, and they looked at the thing they'd come to pick up rather than the man who'd made it. And they left with the same efficiency they'd arrived with. Children were the honest ones. Children stared without apology until their mothers pulled them away with hissed corrections. Some of the braver ones asked questions directly. "What happened to your face, mister? Does it hurt? Were you in a war?" He never minded the children. He'd rather be looked at straight than sideways. The adults mostly managed him the way you manage something you haven't figured out how to categorize. Not with cruelty, not usually, but with a kind of careful distance that amounted, over time, to a particular species of loneliness. Gareth had come to understand that distance better than he'd have chosen to. He understood the whispers that happened when he walked into the saloon for a drink on a Saturday evening, and he understood the way conversations found new directions when he sat down at the counter in the general store, and he understood the way women pulled their children a little closer when he passed on the street, not because they thought he'd hurt anyone, but because the sight of him unnerved something automatic in people, something that lived below intention, below manners, below the part of a person that knows better. He'd stopped arguing with it. That had taken a few years. The first few years he'd been angry, quietly, steadily angry, in a way that he'd turned entirely inward because there was nowhere useful to put it. By the time he was 30, the anger had worn itself down into something more like resignation. And the resignation had eventually become, if not peace exactly, then at least a kind of functional acceptance. This is what his life was. He was useful, he was skilled, he had his work and his dog, and the strange, austere comfort of a routine that asked nothing emotional of him and gave him back the same. But the winter he turned 39 was a bad one, and not just for the cold. He couldn't entirely explain what shifted. Maybe it was the way December light came through his window in the mornings and fell across the empty chair on the other side of the table, and he'd find himself looking at it for longer than made sense. Maybe it was Fletcher getting older, the dog's muzzle gone gray, and the awareness that the hound, who had been his closest daily company for 8 years, was moving into the last portion of his life. Maybe it was the birthday itself, 39, which felt less like another year and more like a door closing on a particular era. A last chance at something he couldn't precisely name but understood was slipping. He wrote the advertisement. He expected silence. The silence, he told himself, would be the answer he already knew was coming, and at least then he'd have tried, and the question would be settled, and he could stop looking at the empty chair. Evelyn Whitlock's letter arrived 6 weeks later, on a Tuesday, when the ground was still frozen and the sky had been the color of old pewter for so many days running that Gareth had stopped expecting it to change. Mercer handed it over the counter without a word, watching him with an expression Gareth couldn't quite read. The envelope was clean, the handwriting precise but not fussy, the postmark from a town in Nebraska he'd vaguely heard of. He put the letter in his coat pocket and carried it back to the forge and set it on the work table and stared at it for approximately 20 minutes, while the fire in the furnace did what fires in furnaces do. Then he sat down on his stool, broke the seal, and read, "Mr. Hale, I will be straightforward with you, as you have been straightforward with me, and I think we will both find that more useful than pleasantries. My name is Evelyn Whitlock. I am 35 years old. I was married for 9 years to a man named Charles Whitlock, who died of a fever 3 years ago and left me with a small amount of debt, a house I had to sell, and the understanding that I am better equipped for a practical life than a comfortable one. I have no children. I have skills in cooking, basic medical care, sewing, and managing household accounts. I am not a woman who frightens easily, and I am not a woman who places a great deal of stock in the kind of appearances that wash off in the rain. You wrote that your scars might disqualify you in my estimation. I want to address that directly because I think you deserve a direct answer. They do not. I read your advertisement 3 times, and what I noticed was not the disclosure about your face, but the manner in which you made it. You wrote it without self-pity and without apology, and those are qualities I find considerably more difficult to come by than an unmarked complexion. I am not writing to you because I am desperate or because I have exhausted other options. I am writing because your advertisement was honest, and I have learned to follow honesty when I find it. If you are willing to correspond further, I am willing as well. If after corresponding you feel this is not a suitable arrangement, I will hold no grievance. I believe those were your words, and I find I agree with the sentiment. Yours in good faith, Evelyn Whitlock." Gareth read the letter twice. Then he set it on the workbench and went back to the piece he'd been working on, a gate hinge for the Hollis farm, needed by Friday, and hammered iron for about 2 hours without stopping. Then he wrote back. They corresponded for 4 months. The letters were not love letters. He wanted to be clear about that, at least to himself. They were correspondence. Practical exchanges of information between 2 people trying to take an honest accounting of each other before making a serious decision. Evelyn wrote about her time in Nebraska, about the years of her marriage, about the things she'd learned that she was glad of, and the things she'd learned that she'd have preferred not to. She wrote about her mother, who was still living, and her sister in St. Louis, and the particular exhaustion of the 3 years since Charles died. Not grief exactly, or not only grief, but the weariness of being a woman alone in circumstances that did not accommodate women alone particularly well. Gareth wrote about the forge, about Red Creek. He described the valley without flattering it. The winters were brutal, the summers brief. The nearest actual town of any size was a day's ride. He described his cabin with the same honesty. He wrote about Fletcher. He wrote once about the fire, more than he'd written about it to anyone, because she had asked directly, "Will you tell me what happened?" And she had asked it without the careful, eggshell quality that people in Red Creek applied to the subject when they approached it at all. And he found that the directness made him want to answer in kind. She'd written back, "You went back in for a pig. That might be the most human thing I've ever heard." He'd read that line 4 times. In March, she wrote to ask if she might come in April, if he was still of the same mind, and she would appreciate an honest answer either way. He wrote back the same day he received the letter, which he never did. He usually took 3 or 4 days to think through his replies. But this time he wrote back immediately, a single paragraph, which said that he was still of the same mind and that he would meet the stagecoach on the 14th. No, the 14th arrived on a Thursday. By 9 in the morning, the news had spread through Red Creek with the particular velocity that news achieves in small settlements where not very much happens, and everyone is, whether they admit it or not, paying close attention to everyone else's business. The stagecoach came through twice a week, Tuesday and Thursday, and by 11 o'clock on this particular Thursday, the main street had a great deal more foot traffic than it normally did at 11 o'clock. Gareth noticed. He noticed from the doorway of the forge, where he'd been standing since 10:30 with his coat on, watching the street, his hat in his hands, turning it slowly in a way that he wasn't aware he was doing until Fletcher nudged his elbow, and he looked down and caught himself. "I know," he told the dog. Fletcher sat down next to him with the air of an animal who had decided to provide moral support and meant to see it through. The stagecoach was due at noon. By 11:30, there were people gathered outside the general store and outside the saloon, and a cluster of women near the post office, and old Mercer himself standing in front of his building with his thumbs in his vest pockets, watching. The preacher was there. The schoolteacher was there. Half the families from the farms south of town, had apparently found reasons to be in town this particular Thursday morning, which was not a coincidence that required any great detective work to unravel. Harlan Fitch was there. That was the one that Gareth marked. Harlan Fitch, who owned the largest cattle operation in the valley, 3,000 acres and more money than the rest of Red Creek put together, stood at the edge of the gathered crowd in his good wool coat with two of his ranch hands behind him. Fitch was 60 years old, broad through the chest and narrow through the eyes, and he had opinions about most things in the valley and made them known without much worry about whether anyone had asked. Gareth and Fitch had a history, the way two men can have a history that consists mostly of silences and one or two specific words that haven't been forgiven. Fitch had said 8 years ago at a town meeting that the settlement would be better served by bringing in a blacksmith from the east who didn't make people uncomfortable to look at. He'd said it in front of a room full of people, and he'd said it in the particular tone that some men use for truths they've decided don't require softening. The room had gone quiet in the way rooms go quiet when something lands that can't be taken back. Gareth had said nothing. He had gathered his things and walked out and ridden home and spent 2 days working the furnace hard enough that his arms ached for a week. Then he'd come back, because there was no other blacksmith within 30 miles and the work needed doing, and because something in him had decided, quietly and without drama, that he would not be run out of the place where he'd built his life by a man who'd never had to work for anything. Fitch hadn't apologized. Fitch was not a man who apologized. And now Fitch was standing in the street with his hands in his coat pockets, watching, waiting for the stagecoach the same as everyone else. Gareth put his hat on and walked out of the forge and down the street and stood at the stage stop to wait. He could feel them watching him. He'd been feeling them watch him for 12 years. It had become a kind of constant weather, the way you stop noticing the wind until it's suddenly very cold. But today it was sharp again and present, and he was aware of every single pair of eyes on the street and the weight of each one. He stood straight. He kept his hands easy at his sides. He looked at the road. Fletcher sat next to his boot. The stagecoach was 11 minutes late. Gareth counted. He was not a man who counted minutes under ordinary circumstances, but these were not ordinary circumstances, and his mind had to go somewhere, and it went to counting. The coach came around the bend at the north end of the street in a cloud of road dust and the sound of hooves and creaking wood, and Gareth felt his chest do something complicated that he chose not to examine. He heard the crowd settle into itself, that particular quality of silence that isn't silence at all, but rather the absence of casual noise, every person breathing and watching. The driver brought the coach to a stop. The horses blew and stamped. The driver, a weathered man named Cal, who'd run this route for years and knew Gareth well enough to nod at, looked down from the box with an expression that gave nothing away. The door opened from inside. A woman stepped down from the coach. She was not what he'd imagined, though he hadn't let himself imagine much. Medium height, sturdy in the way of a person accustomed to physical work, dark hair pinned up under a plain gray traveling hat. Her coat was good quality but not new, her boots the same. She had a traveling bag over one arm and a second bag that the driver tossed down from the boot, which she caught the strap of with a practical efficiency that suggested she'd done it before. She set the bag on his ground and looked up, and Gareth was suddenly, acutely aware of which side of his face was facing the road. The left side, the scarred side, turned toward her completely because that was where he was standing, and he hadn't thought to position himself differently, and wouldn't have, not really, because what would be the point? Evelyn Whitlock looked at his face. She did not look away. She did not flinch or blink rapidly or let her eyes slide sideways to somewhere easier. She looked at his face the way you look at something you've already decided about, taking it in with steady attention, and then she picked up her bag and walked toward him and extended her hand. "Mr. Hale," she said. Her voice was lower than he'd expected, clear and direct, without a tremor in it. He took her hand and shook it. Her grip was firm. She met his eyes, both of them, the scarred side and the other, without any of the careful negotiation of gaze that people practiced, the looking near but not at that he was so practiced in receiving. "Mrs. Whitlock," he said, "welcome to Red Creek." "Thank you," she said. She glanced once, briefly, at the gathered crowd on either side of the street, the women at the post office, the men at the saloon, Fitch in his good wool coat, and then she looked back at Gareth with an expression he couldn't entirely read, but which contained, he thought, a faint quality of unsurprise. You told me the town was small, she said. I did. You didn't mention they'd all be here. I didn't know they would be. She looked at the crowd again, and then she looked at him, and something shifted in her expression, not softening exactly, but settling, like a woman who has made a decision and is done reconsidering it. Well, she said, perhaps you could show me the cabin. I expect I'll want to see what I'm working with. The walk from the stage stop to the far end of the street and around to the forge and the cabin behind it was approximately 400 feet, and Gareth had walked it several thousand times in the past 12 years without thinking about it much. He was thinking about it now. He was thinking about the sound of their footsteps on the packed dirt, and about the precise quality of the silence the crowd maintained as they passed. Not hostile exactly, but watchful, waiting, with the alert attention of people expecting something to happen. He was thinking about whether Evelyn was aware of being watched, and whether it bothered her, and then she answered both questions by speaking in a normal conversational tone as they walked, not quieter than she'd have spoken anywhere else. How long have you had the forge? 11 years, he said. Do you do all the work yourself? Had a boy helping Summers for a while. He took work elsewhere last fall. Do you need the help? He considered. There are seasons when it would be useful. She looked at the forge building as they turned off the main street and approached it, taking in the structure with the same kind of direct, inventory-minded attention she'd turned on him. You built it. Expanded it. The original frame was already here when I came. What's through there? She nodded at the narrow path beside the forge. The cabin. All right, she said. Show me. The cabin was what it was. He'd known she was coming for 3 weeks, and he'd cleaned it with a thoroughness he hadn't applied to it in years. Scrubbed the floor, aired the bedding, found actual curtains from somewhere in the bottom of a chest, and hung them at the 2 windows, arranged the kitchen shelves with some concern for how they looked rather than just what was on them. He'd cut fresh wood. He'd patched the place where the plaster had cracked over the door frame, badly, but it was patched. He pushed the door open and stood back to let her in. She stepped inside and stood in the center of the main room for a moment, looking around. The furnishings were spare. The table, 2 chairs, a cook stove, shelves, a settee that had seen better years, a braided rug on the floor that was showing its age at the edges. The back wall had his tools hung in order. There was a door to the right that led to the bedroom, and another that he'd been using as a sort of storage room. She didn't say anything for a moment. He stood in the doorway, waiting, with the particular tense stillness of a man who has shown someone something he made and is waiting for a verdict. The stove drafts well? She asked. Well enough. Pulls a little in east wind. She went to it and opened the firebox, looked at it, closed it. She ran a hand along the edge of the mantel above the fireplace in the corner, checking, he realized, for the actual state of the dust, which, he was relieved to note, she did not find in abundance. The storage room, she said, gesturing at the second door. Could be a second bedroom, he said, or a study, or whatever it needs to be. I haven't had reason to do much with it. She opened the door and looked in. The room was small, currently occupied by a collection of things that had no better home. An old trunk, some rope, 2 broken chairs he'd meant to repair, 3 years of accumulated objects that had been placed there temporarily and stayed. She surveyed it with an expression that suggested she was already mentally relocating everything in it. The curtains, she said, turning back to the main room. Yes. Did you put those up recently? A pause. 3 weeks ago. She looked at him. Something crossed her face. Not quite a smile, not fully, but adjacent to one. They're crooked, she said. I know. The left one especially. I noticed. She turned back to the window and looked at the curtain in question, then at the view outside, the back of the forge, the vegetable patch, the slope of the valley rising to the tree line. It's quieter than I expected, she said. It gets less quiet in summer. Birds. I like birds. The mountain bluebirds come in May, he said. There's a pair that nests in the eave every year. She turned to look at him, and he realized he'd said something more than he'd intended. Or maybe exactly what he'd intended, without the usual editing. He didn't know what to do with that, so he didn't do anything. I'll need to see the water situation, she said. Well or creek? Well, south side of the forge. Good water. All right. She set her traveling bag on the table with the decisiveness of someone marking a place. I'll need to unpack. And then I'd like to sit down and talk practically about what we're both expecting, because I think the letter correspondence covered a great deal, but not everything. And I'd rather have those conversations sooner than have them occur to us later, at inconvenient moments. That's... He stopped. Yes, that's agreeable. Good. She looked around the room one more time and then at him. Mr. Hale, one thing before we sit down. Yes. Whatever those people out there were hoping to see when I got off that stagecoach, I know what they were hoping to see. I thought you might. She met his eyes steadily. I want you to know that it had no effect on my assessment of this situation. He looked at her for a moment. Why not? Because I didn't come here to satisfy their curiosity, she said. I came here because of your letters. The town's opinion of you is something I'll form on my own, over time, and I'd prefer to do it without assistance. He didn't have a response to that felt adequate, so he said nothing, and she seemed to accept the nothing as a reasonable answer. All right, she said. I'll get settled. I imagine you have work. I do, he said. I'll put coffee on first. I'd appreciate that. He moved to the stove and she moved to her bag. And the cabin, which had been quiet in the particular way of a place no one had shared for a long time, became something slightly different. A place with two people in it, moving around each other with the careful attentiveness of strangers at the beginning of something that neither of them could quite see the shape of yet. That evening, after supper, which was a straightforward meal that neither of them made a production of, eggs and bread and salt pork, because the pantry was what it was, and he hadn't thought as far ahead as he probably should have, they sat at the table with coffee and talked. The conversation lasted 3 hours. It was not easy conversation in the way that some conversations are easy, the kind that runs along without resistance. It was the other kind, the kind with pauses where you actually had to think, and places where one of them would say something that required the other to sit with it for a moment before responding. Evelyn spoke about her first marriage with the particular plainness of a woman who had made her peace with a thing, but wasn't going to perform more peace than she had. Charles had been a decent man, she said. Not a bad man. But they'd spent 9 years circling around the things that needed to be said, and she'd watched him die without having said most of them, and that experience had altered her opinion of indirect communication permanently. What things? Gareth asked. She looked at him. That's a fair question. She turned her cup in her hands. That I was lonely inside the marriage. That I'd hoped for something, particular, I suppose, and had understood over time that it wasn't going to come. That I'd stopped hoping for it and made my peace with that, and then had to make a separate peace with having made the first peace too quickly. She paused. He wasn't unkind. He just wasn't present in the way I needed someone to be present. Gareth considered that. What does present mean to you? She looked at him directly. Exactly what the word says. Here, in the actual conversation, not somewhere else inside your head while the other person talks. I understand that. I thought you might. He told her, after a while, about what it was like to be the man in Red Creek whose face everyone had decided something about. He said it without complaint. He'd been down that road enough times to know that complaint accomplished nothing. But he said it plainly, the way you describe a weather condition to someone who's going to have to live with it. The town would talk. They were already talking. Whatever she did or didn't do in the next weeks and months would be observed and discussed in ways that neither of them could control, and she should understand that going in. Are you worried I'll be bothered by it? She asked. I'm telling you what it will be. What you do with it is your own matter. People talked about me in Nebraska, she said. Widow woman with a failed farm and a dead husband's debt. I've had some practice at being the subject of other people's opinions. This might be different. Probably. She set down her cup. Mr. Hale. Gareth. A brief pause. Gareth. She seemed to be testing the word for fit. I will be honest with you about something. I'd prefer it. I didn't come here certain this would work. I'm not certain of it now. I came here because it seemed like an honest situation, and because I'm 35 years old and I've made enough decisions based on what was comfortable over what was right, that I wanted to try making one that was harder. He was quiet for a moment. I didn't think you were certain. You don't seem the type to expect certainty. No. Good. She pushed back her chair. I'm going to sleep. The journey was long and I'm tired, and I think clearer when I'm not exhausted. She stood, and then she looked at him with a directness that had become, over the course of the evening, slightly less foreign feeling and slightly more like something he was beginning to understand about her. The curtain situation will be addressed tomorrow. I have no objection to that. I should hope not. She took the lamp and went to the bedroom, and Gareth sat alone at the table in the dark with his coffee cup and the faint sounds of the cabin settling in the cold night, and Fletcher breathing slowly on the rug by the stove, and something in the room that had not been there this morning. A quality he couldn't name precisely, something like the feeling before weather turns, when the air shifts and something is coming that hasn't arrived yet, but is no longer very far away. He was in the forge at first light, which was where he always was at first light, because iron waited for no one's emotional situation. He worked a commission for the Parson farm, 3 sets of gate hinges, a set of fireplace tools, and he kept his mind on the work, which he was good at. The forge was where his mind settled, where the heat and the rhythm and the physical demand of the thing collected him into something that functioned cleanly. He hammered and shaped and quenched, and the morning moved around him the way mornings did. Around 7, he heard the cabin door. He kept working. He heard water at the well. She'd found it on her own then. He heard movement that suggested she was in the cabin, and after a time he smelled coffee, which stopped him for a moment in a way he hadn't anticipated. The smell of coffee coming from somewhere that wasn't him, making it alone. She appeared in the forge doorway at 8 with 2 cups. I didn't know how you took it, she said. Black. She held out the cup. He took it with his work hand, which was not clean, and she didn't comment on that. She stood in the doorway and looked at the forge with the same inventory attention she'd turned on everything else. He drank his coffee and waited. You made those? She nodded at the set of fireplace tools hanging on the wall. His own, done some years back. Not a commission, but a thing he'd made for himself, and he'd spent more time on them than was strictly necessary. Yes, they're good work. Thank you. She looked at the tools on his wall, the organized chaos of a working forge, the fire in the furnace, and then at him. There's bacon if you want it. I'll come in when this section's done. All right. She went back to the cabin. He went back to the iron. And the day began. A Thursday, the 14th of April, in Red Creek, Wyoming territory, a small settlement at the bottom of a long valley where the wind came down off the mountains with opinions about everything it touched. It was an ordinary day, in most of the ways that days are ordinary. It was also the first day of something that neither of them, in those early hours, had the full measure of yet, something that was just beginning to find its shape, rough-edged and uncertain and not particularly smooth, which was, it turned out, exactly what it needed to be. The first week was strange in the way that all genuinely new things are strange. Not bad, not good, just unfamiliar in a way that required constant small adjustments. Evelyn was up before him most mornings, which surprised him. He'd assumed, without particularly thinking about it, that he'd be the early one. He always had been, the forge pulling him out of sleep the way some men got pulled by drink or habit. But she was already at the stove when he came through the main room most days, not making a production of it, just there, moving with the efficiency of a woman who'd been running a household alone long enough that the routine lived in her hands rather than her head. She rearranged the kitchen shelves on the 3rd day. He noticed when he came in for the midday meal and found everything shifted. The flour moved to a lower position, the coffee things consolidated, the jumble of tin cups he'd acquired over the years reduced to 4 that actually matched, and the rest relocated to the storage room. He stood in front of the shelves for a moment, taking inventory. If it bothers you, I can put it back, she said from behind him, without looking up from what she was doing at the table, which was mending one of her own garments. It doesn't bother me, he said, which was true. I just need to learn where things are. The logic should be apparent. It is. She looked up then. You have 8 tin cups. People leave things. Who leaves a tin cup? He thought about it. Mostly people who came to the forge and had coffee and forgot them. I kept thinking they'd come back for them. Has anyone come back for them? Not yet. She returned to her mending. He located the coffee things in their new position and put the kettle on. The 2 I kept are the ones without dents, she said. That's reasonable. The others are in the storage room if you want them. I don't particularly want them. Good, she said. Neither do I. It was not a romantic exchange. It wasn't meant to be. But there was something in the ordinariness of it, the back and forth of two people negotiating the small logistics of shared space, that Gareth found himself replaying later at the forge, not with any specific feeling he could name, just turning it over the way you turn a well-made piece of ironwork in your hands, checking the weight of it. The town did not stay quiet about their situation. He hadn't expected it would. Mrs. Hollis came by the fourth day, ostensibly to pick up the gate hinges he'd finished, which was legitimate enough since he had finished them. But she lingered in the forge doorway for considerably longer than hinges required, and her eyes kept moving to the cabin in the way of a person hoping a door will open. "Your wife settling in all right?" she asked. "She is. It must be a lot to take in, coming all this way." A pause. "From Nebraska, wasn't it?" "That's right." "Long journey." "It is." He handed her the hinges wrapped in cloth and waited with the patience of a man who had learned that the fastest way through these conversations was to give them very little material to work with. Mrs. Hollis held the parcel and did not immediately leave. "People are curious," she said, in the tone of someone who considers curiosity a force of nature rather than a choice. "People are usually curious," he agreed. "She seems capable, from what we saw." "She is." Mrs. Hollis shifted her weight. "Will she be coming to the Sunday service? Reverend Dawes would be glad to meet her properly. We all would." He thought about how to answer that in a way that was honest without being blunt enough to require further conversation. "I expect she'll make her own decisions about what she attends." Mrs. Hollis received that answer, decided it was all she was going to get, and left. He went inside that evening and mentioned it to Evelyn without particularly intending to. It came up naturally in the course of describing his day, and she listened without interrupting, which was something he'd noticed about her. She didn't fill silences with commentary while he was still in the middle of a thought. "Was she unkind?" Evelyn asked. "No, nosy. There's a difference." "I've always thought so." Evelyn considered. "I'll come to Sunday service." He looked up from his plate. "Not because she suggested it," she said, "because I'll need to meet these people eventually if I'm going to live here, and I'd rather meet them on a day when they're supposed to be on their best behavior." He almost smiled at that. He didn't quite, but it was close. "That's a practical way of looking at it," he said. "Most things have a practical way of looking at them," she said, "if you're willing to find it." Sunday came, and she put on her better dress. Dark blue wool, plain at the collar, nothing that called attention to itself. And they walked the 400 feet from the cabin to the main street and the length of the street to the church with the lopsided steeple. And Gareth was aware, in the particular way he was always aware of it, of the Sunday morning crowd gathering and rearranging itself around their presence. They sat in a pew toward the middle. He always sat toward the back when he came, which was not as often as the Reverend would have liked. Evelyn chose the middle without consulting him, and he sat beside her, and the congregation managed to leave a certain perimeter of empty space around them that was not quite natural but that nobody acknowledged. During the singing, Evelyn sang. Not loudly, not performing anything, just singing the hymn the way a person sings who was taught to sing in church as a child and hasn't lost the habit. She had a decent voice. He did not sing. He stood beside her and looked at the front of the church and thought about the hinge commission he'd be starting on Monday. Afterward, in the yard, 3 women came over with the particular forward energy of people who have decided to be welcoming and mean it sincerely, even if the sincerity is slightly overlaid with curiosity. They were the schoolteacher, Miss Price, and 2 farm wives, the Danner sisters who'd married brothers and run adjacent properties south of town. They introduced themselves to Evelyn with the compressed enthusiasm of women who'd been discussing doing this all week. Gareth stood slightly back, the way he always positioned himself in these groupings, giving the conversation room without being part of it. He watched Evelyn navigate the introductions with a straight back and a direct manner that was neither warm nor cold, simply present, answering questions without elaborating unnecessarily, asking one back for every 2 she answered. "How are you finding the cabin?" one of the Danner sisters asked. "It has good bones," Evelyn said, "and a stove that drafts a little in east wind, which I'm told is a manageable situation." The Danner sister laughed. It was a real laugh, surprised out of her rather than performed. "That's the valley for you. Everything manages." So I'm discovering, Evelyn said. Miss Price, the school teacher, was perhaps 30, dark-haired and brisk in the way of a person who spends all day managing 20 children of varying ages and has adapted accordingly. She looked at Evelyn with a frankness that Gareth appreciated because it didn't include the particular sidelong quality that most of the town's curiosity had. "Have you taught?" she asked Evelyn. "Some. I helped my husband with accounts. Some tutoring when we needed the income. We only have the one teacher here," Miss Price said, "and 23 students. It gets unwieldy in winter." "I imagine," Evelyn said, and there was something in the exchange that suggested a door had opened a small amount, not swung wide but cracked, in the way that practical mutual interest creates openings that social performance can't. They walked home afterward, and Gareth let the silence sit for a block before speaking. "That went better than it might have," he said. "The school teacher seems competent." "She is. Took that job right out of normal school and stayed. Most people try to move on to somewhere larger." "Some people understand that small places need good teachers more than large ones do," Evelyn said. He glanced at her. She was looking straight ahead, the line of her jaw even, and decided, the way it got when she was thinking rather than not thinking. "You liked her," he said. "I don't know her yet." "A beat. But she asked me a real question instead of a polite one, and I find that I respond better to real questions." "I've noticed that about you," he said. She looked at him sideways. "Is that an observation or a complaint?" "An observation." "Good," she said, and returned to looking at the street. Fletcher met them at the gate, tail moving with the slow sincerity of an old dog who doesn't waste energy on theatrical enthusiasm. It was 2 weeks before the first real difficulty. It came from a direction Gareth had been monitoring but hoping wouldn't materialize. Not from any direct confrontation, not yet, but from the accumulated small weight of the town's attitude pressing on Evelyn in ways he could see but couldn't intercept. She went to the general store alone on a Tuesday. She'd done it twice before without incident, or at least she'd said nothing about incident, and he'd understood from her manner that she preferred to handle these errands without him alongside her, which he respected. She didn't need managing. She'd said as much on their first real evening of conversation, not those words exactly, but that meaning. She came home from the store with her purchases and her expression flatter than usual. Not upset. Evelyn's upset didn't look like most people's upset. It looked like stillness rather than movement, like a surface that stopped reflecting. But something had happened. He waited. She unpacked the parcels and put things on their shelves in the correct places, which she'd established within the first week, and which she maintained with the consistency of a person for whom order is not an aesthetic preference, but a functional one. Then she sat down. "Mrs. Parson," she said. "What did she do?" "Nothing I can precisely complain about." Evelyn folded her hands on the table. "She was perfectly civil. She helped me find the thread I was looking for, and she weighed the flour correctly, and she didn't overcharge me. But when I was leaving, 2 women came in. I don't know their names. And there was a shift." She was choosing her words with care, the way she did when she was being precise about something that resisted precision. Mrs. Parsons' manner changed, became more careful, like someone who'd remembered something they'd been about to forget. Gareth knew exactly what she'd seen. He'd watched that particular performance more times than he could count. The micro-adjustment that happened in certain people when they remembered which category they'd placed him in and recalibrated accordingly. The 2 women coming in had reminded Mrs. Parson of her position in a social fabric, and Mrs. Parson had responded to that reminder, not maliciously, probably not even consciously, just reflexively. "It isn't about you," he said. "I know that." She looked at him. "That's not what bothered me." "What bothered you?" She was quiet for a moment. "That you've been managing that for 12 years, she said, "and I was bothered by one afternoon of it." He didn't have an immediate response to that. "I adapted," he said eventually. "You shouldn't have had to." "No," he agreed. But the list of things people shouldn't have to adapt to and the list of things they actually adapt to are not the same list, and it's not particularly useful to spend a lot of time on the difference. She looked at him for a moment longer than usual. "You're more philosophical about it than I would be." "I had more practice." She exhaled, not a sigh exactly, more the release of something she'd been holding on to since the store. "I'm going to learn everyone's names," she said. "All of them. The women who came in, the people who look at you sideways. I'm going to know their names and their situations and what they need from the forge, and I'm going to be as ordinary and present as anyone in this town until there's no reasonable story they can tell themselves about us that makes us unusual. He looked at her. That's a long campaign. I have a long patience when I've decided something, she said. He believed her. The child appeared at the end of the third week, which was earlier than Gareth had expected because children were usually kept away from him by the same reflexive parental caution that characterized most of Red Creek's management of his existence. He'd accepted that years ago. Children who weren't kept away generally came around to liking him because children operated on information they gathered themselves rather than inheriting their adults' assessments, but the opportunity for that rarely arose. The girl came around the side of the forge on a Thursday afternoon when the light was going long and gold and the valley was doing the thing it did in late April where it suddenly remembered it could be beautiful. She was perhaps 7, small for her age, with dark braids and a serious face that carried the particular gravity of children who spend a lot of time in adult company. She had something in her hand, a small iron figure, a horse, roughly made, the kind of thing that came from a box of miscellaneous hardware at a store rather than from any craftsman. She stood at the forge doorway and looked at Gareth without the usual flinching recalibration, just looked, taking him in with the flat assessment of a child gathering data. Your horse is broken, she said, holding out the figure. The front right leg was snapped off at the fetlock. A clean break, recent. It is, he said. Can you fix it? He looked at the figure. It was cheap tin, not iron, soft, poor quality, the kind that didn't take repair well. He took it from her carefully and turned it in his hands. Solder might hold it, he said. It won't be as strong as it was. Stronger than no leg, the girl said with the pragmatism of a child who has already made peace with imperfection. He almost smiled. That's true enough. What's your name? Nora Bell. Whose daughter are you? My papa works at the feed store, she said. My mama said I shouldn't bother you. You're not bothering me. She processed that information. She said you were busy. I am busy, but this is the kind of thing I can do while being busy. He moved to the work table and found the solder wire, which was in the 4th drawer from the left, and the small iron he kept for fine work. Come in if you want. It's hot in here. She came in. She stood at a careful distance from the furnace, not frightened of it, respecting it, which was different. The distinction that separated children who'd grown up with fires from children who hadn't. She watched him work with an attention that was genuine rather than polite. Does it hurt? She asked. What? She gestured at the left side of his face, direct, without cruelty, the question of a person who actually wants to know. Not anymore, he said. It did for a long time. What does it feel like now? He thought about it honestly. Tight sometimes, in the cold. The skin doesn't move the same as regular skin. She absorbed this. My grandpa has a scar on his hand from a mill blade, she said. He says the same thing about cold. Your grandpa's right. He usually is, she said, in a tone that suggested this was a source of mild frustration. He finished the solder joint and held the figure up to the light, checked the angle of the repaired leg, decided it would hold if she was careful with it. He handed it back. She examined the repair with a close attention he recognized, the same attention he brought to assessing his own work. Then she looked up at him. Thank you, she said. You're welcome, Nora Bell. She turned to leave and then stopped at the doorway. I'll come back, she said, not asking permission, simply informing him of her intentions. I'll be here, he said. She left, small and purposeful, back around the side of the forge and out of sight, and Gareth returned to the commission he'd been working on, the hinge plates for the Whitmore property, which were due by the end of the week. Evelyn appeared in the doorway 20 minutes later. Was there a child here? She asked. Nora Bell. Her father works at the feed store. What did she want? She had a broken tin horse. Evelyn leaned against the doorframe and looked at him with an expression he was beginning to be able to read, which he was aware represented some kind of development, the slow accumulation of knowing how someone's face worked. Did you fix it? She asked. Best I could. It was cheap tin. Stronger than no leg, she said. He looked up. She say that to you too? She told me when she passed the cabin window. Evelyn's expression had that almost smile quality again. She said you were nice and your face looked like a map. He was quiet for a moment. A map? I believe she meant it as a compliment. I think she might have, he said. The weeks moved. April turned into May, and the mountain bluebirds returned to the eave as he'd said they would, and Evelyn stood at the kitchen window one morning watching them with her coffee cup held in both hands, and he stood slightly behind her and watched her watch them, which was its own kind of thing. The garden was her project now, or had become so by natural accretion. She'd assessed his vegetable patch with the same inventory eye she applied to everything and concluded that it was functional but inefficient, and had reorganized the planting with a system he hadn't used, but which, he had to admit by the end of May, was demonstrably better. "How did you learn to garden?" he asked one evening when they were sitting on the porch, a thing they'd fallen into without discussing it, the end-of-day coffee on the porch, Fletcher between them, the valley going dark in stages. "My mother," she said, "and necessity." After Charles died, the kitchen garden was a significant portion of how I ate for 2 winters. 2 winters. The first winter was difficult financially. The second was better, but not much. By the third, I'd found the work I could do. She paused. I did some nursing. One of the local doctors let me assist him in exchange for a small wage. I was useful enough that he kept me on. Could you have stayed? Kept that work? She turned her cup in her hands. Probably, but it wasn't what I wanted the next 20 years to look like. A pause. Not from the work itself. The work was good. I was glad of it. But living that way, alone in a town where I was always the widow who needed accommodation, there's a kind of tired that comes from that. Not laziness. The other kind. I know that kind, he said. I thought you might, she said, looking at the valley. Fletcher sighed heavily and rearranged himself so his head was on Gareth's boot. He likes you, Evelyn observed. He likes anyone who doesn't make sudden movements. He slept on my side of the bed last night. Gareth looked down at the dog. Fletcher. Fletcher did not appear troubled by this information. I don't mind, Evelyn said. I like dogs. You didn't say. There are a lot of things I haven't said yet, she said simply. We've only been married 5 weeks. He looked at her sideways. She was looking at the darkening line of the tree line, her profile even against the fading light. 5 weeks. He'd have said it felt longer, but not in a bad way, in the way of something that had settled into its place faster than expected, like a piece of ironwork that fits the joint on the first try, when you'd been braced for adjustment. He didn't say any of that. He drank his coffee, but Nora Bell came back, the following Tuesday, and then the Tuesday after that, and it became a kind of standing arrangement without anyone formally establishing it as such. She'd appear at the forge doorway after school, sometimes with a question about something she'd seen, sometimes with a broken object in need of attention, sometimes with no apparent agenda beyond presence, sitting on the 3-legged stool near the work table and watching him work with the devoted attention of a child who has found something genuinely interesting. She wasn't afraid of his face. She'd stopped remarking on it after the first 2 visits, not because she'd forgotten or was avoiding it, but because it had become simply part of the information she had about him, filed away and incorporated. He was Gareth, who was the blacksmith, whose face looked like a map, who fixed broken things and knew about iron and was patient when she asked questions and didn't talk to her like she was smaller than she was. He found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he'd started keeping track of which day was Tuesday. Evelyn noticed. She didn't say much about it, just that she'd started putting an extra cup out on Tuesday afternoons, the smaller one, and she'd make a little extra of whatever was available in case the child was hungry. Nora was always hungry, with the automatic, unself-conscious hunger of a 7-year-old whose body is working on something and needs the fuel. One afternoon, Evelyn came out to the forge while Nora was there and showed the girl how she mended leather. It was Gareth's work gloves, one of them torn at the seam, and Evelyn sat on the bench outside the forge door, and the child sat beside her watching, and Gareth, inside at the furnace, could hear the conversation in pieces. Evelyn's measured voice explaining the stitch, Nora's questions, Evelyn's direct answers, no more elaborate than necessary. He didn't examine the feeling that came with listening to it. He just kept working. But winter, when it came creeping in around the edges of May and June in the form of late cold snaps and sharp-tempered winds off the mountain, brought something else with it too. a hardening. Not in his house, not between him and Evelyn, who had found a rhythm that was not romantic. He would not have called it romantic, not yet, not honestly, but was something, was real, was the daily accumulation of two people who had decided to be present with each other and were doing a reasonable job of it. The hardening was out there, in the town. He could feel it. It had started slowly, with the same ambient distance that always characterized Red Creek's relationship with him. But by June, it had acquired a specific texture that he recognized, not just distance, but something with a direction to it. He could feel it at the forge when men brought work, but wouldn't quite look at Evelyn if she brought out coffee. He could feel it in the store when the conversation stopped a beat too long and started again a beat too quickly. He could feel it most in the particular way Harlan Fitch's ranch hands had started coming by to pick up work that Fitch always sent them for, and the way they'd stand in the forge doorway with their hats in their hands and not quite look at anything directly. Not at him, not at the cabin, not at Evelyn, if she was visible, like men who've been given some instruction about where not to let their attention land. Fitch himself hadn't come to the forge in years. He sent his men. Gareth mentioned none of this to Evelyn. She noticed anyway. "Fitch," she said one evening, not a question. "You've heard?" "I've heard things. Mrs. Danner, the younger one, Clara. She said something last week at the schoolhouse when I was helping Miss Price. She said it carefully, the way people say things they want to half take back, but the meaning was plain enough." "What was the meaning?" Evelyn looked at him steadily. "That Harlan Fitch has opinions about you that he's been keeping largely to himself, and that having me here has apparently given those opinions a new audience." "What kind of opinions?" "The kind that dress themselves up as concern for the community," she said, with a flatness in her voice that he hadn't heard before, a particular register of cold. "Apparently there's a version of this story where you've brought a woman here under false pretenses, and I'm to be pitied, and the town ought to do something." "He's wrong on every count," Gareth said. "Yes," she said. "I know that." She looked at her hands on the table, then back up at him. "Do you know what I find most interesting about it?" "What?" "That his version requires me to be someone who can't make her own assessment. He needs me to be foolish or desperate or deceived, because if I'm none of those things, and I chose to come here with full knowledge of who you are, then his story doesn't work." Gareth was quiet for a moment. "His story has never required much cooperation from the truth." "No," she said. "I'm learning that about him." She straightened. "He'll do something. People like that always do something when they feel their version of events is being challenged." She looked at Gareth with the steady, unflinching attention that had first undone him, standing at the stage stop with his hat in his hands. "When he does, I want you to let me handle it." "Evelyn, I'm not asking to fight your battles," she said, and her voice had a precision in it that stopped him. "I'm telling you that certain things are better said by certain people, and when the time comes, I'll know what needs to be said. Trust my judgment on that." He looked at her for a long moment. "All right," he said. She nodded once, the nod of a woman who has made a note of a commitment and will not forget it. Outside, the valley wind came down from the mountain with its usual opinions, moving through the eave where the bluebirds had nested, rattling the window glass in its frame, covering the distant sound of Red Creek going about its evening business. The lanterns coming on in the saloon, the parsons locking up the store, Harlan Fitch's big house on the hill at the north end of the valley, lit up like it always was, like a man who spent money on lamplight to remind himself and everyone below how much of it he had. Fletcher got up from his place by the stove and came to put his graying head on Evelyn's knee. She put her hand on him without looking down. She was still looking at Gareth, and the wind kept coming the way it always did, cold off the mountain and full of things that hadn't arrived yet but were no longer far away. It happened on a Saturday in July, when the heat had settled into the valley like something that intended to stay. The kind of Saturday where the main street of Red Creek filled up naturally, people finishing their week's work, coming in from the farms for supplies, gathering at the general store or the saloon with the unhurried quality of people who've earned the afternoon. The air smelled of dust and horse and the particular dry heat that came off the surrounding rock faces in midsummer, and the mountains stood at the edges of the valley in that hard-edged way they had when the sky was very clear and very blue. Gareth had come to town to collect a shipment of iron stock that had arrived on the Tuesday coach and that Mercer had been holding for him at the post office. A straightforward errand, 20 minutes, maybe 30. Evelyn had come with him. She'd been wanting to speak with Miss Price about the possibility of helping at the schoolhouse in the fall, and the school teacher had her rooms above the post office, so they'd walked in together and separated at the main street. Evelyn toward the post office, and upstairs, Gareth toward Mercer's counter. He'd collected the iron, signed for it, arranged to have it held until he could bring the cart around. He was coming back out onto the main street, moving without particular hurry, when he heard Fitch's voice carrying across the open air with the practiced volume of a man who has spent 60 years being the largest presence in any room and has never seen a reason to modulate it. Harlan Fitch was standing in front of the saloon with two of his ranch hands and a third man Gareth recognized as Dwight Calloway, who ran the second largest cattle operation in the valley, and whose relationship with Fitch was the kind of alliance that forms between men who aren't friends but share common interests in keeping things arranged a certain way. There were other people nearby. A cluster outside the general store, two men at the hitching post, a family just coming out of the dry goods shop. Saturday foot traffic. An audience, in other words, though not one that had assembled for this specific purpose. Not yet. Gareth had been measuring Fitch's silences for 8 years, and he understood, from the angle of the man's body and the particular way his voice was carrying, that this particular moment had been building and had now arrived. "There he is," Fitch said, not to Gareth, not directly, but in the carrying voice that was meant to be heard. "Man of the hour." Gareth stopped walking. Fitch turned to look at him directly. He had the kind of face that had probably been called handsome at 50 and had since settled into something harder, full of its own convictions, wearing them visibly. "Hail," he said. "Fitch. Heard your mail-order wife is asking around about working at the schoolhouse." Fitch said it conversationally, the way you'd comment on weather. "That right?" Gareth said nothing. "I was just telling Dwight here." Fitch gestured at Calloway, who had the expression of a man who knows he's been recruited into something and has made peace with it, that it's an interesting situation. Woman comes all this way, takes up with a man who... He paused, and the pause was doing work, manufactured, deliberate. "Well, a man of limited prospects." "You have work that needs doing," Gareth said. "You know where the forge is. Otherwise, I've got nothing to say to you today." "That's the thing, though." Fitch took a step forward, not threatening exactly, just claiming ground, which was the way Fitch operated. "I've been thinking about the forge, about whether Red Creek actually needs the particular arrangement it's got." He looked at the small, half-formed crowd around them with the ease of a man who's performed this kind of thing before. "I've been corresponding with a smith in Cheyenne, younger man. Both his eyes worked the same. No particular history." The crowd had stilled. Gareth was aware of the exact quality of that stillness, the held breath of a group of people watching something that they've decided, individually and collectively, not to interrupt. He kept his voice level. "That's your right." "I think it is." Fitch nodded. "I also think your wife..." He said the word with a quality that Gareth felt in his back teeth. "Might have done herself a better service staying in Nebraska. Whatever situation she was in there, it can't have been so desperate as to require this." His gesture took in Gareth completely, face and all, the way a man gestures at something he's decided is beneath cataloging seriously. The words landed in the open air and sat there. Gareth heard, from behind him and to the left, a sound, footsteps, quick and even, on the wooden boards of the post office steps. He didn't turn around. He knew those footsteps. "Mr. Fitch?" Evelyn's voice came from beside him. He hadn't heard her cross the street, but she was there, slightly forward of his left shoulder, facing Fitch with her hands still and her back straight. Fitch looked at her with the expression of a man recalculating. He'd been performing for the crowd, working a particular angle, and her arrival had shifted the geometry of the thing. "Mrs. Hale," he said, with a courtesy that cost him nothing and was worth exactly that. "I heard most of what you said," Evelyn said. Her voice was even. Not raised, not cold in the way of performed coldness, just clear. "I want to respond to one part of it specifically, if you don't mind." "I don't imagine my minding would stop you," Fitch said. "No," she agreed, "it wouldn't. You said whatever situation I was in Nebraska, it couldn't have been so desperate as to require..." She stopped, the pause deliberate now, mirroring his own technique back at him. "You gestured at my husband, I want to make sure I understood what you were implying. Fitch's chin came up slightly. I think it was plain. It was, she said. That's why I want to address it plainly. She turned just enough to indicate Gareth without taking her eyes off Fitch. I want to tell you what those scars are, since you seem to have formed a view of them without the relevant information. Mrs. Hale, this is a public street. Yes, she said. It is. And there are people here who have lived next to this man for 12 years and have never heard what I'm about to say, so I'd appreciate the opportunity. The street was very quiet. Gareth could hear his own breathing and the faint sound of a horse somewhere down the far end, and nothing else. Fitch said nothing. He had the expression of a man who has realized the ground has shifted under his feet and is deciding what to do about it. Evelyn turned to face the street. Not theatrical, not performing, just turning so that the people gathered could hear her clearly. My husband was 27 years old, she said, when the alderman barn caught fire in the night. He went in and got the alderman boy out. He went back in for the livestock. He went in a third time for an animal that had run the wrong direction. Part of the roof came down while he was inside. She paused, letting it land. He carries those scars because he went back twice when any reasonable person would have stopped at once. The alderman boy is alive and grown somewhere because of what my husband's face looks like now. She turned back to Fitch. Her voice stayed even. You said those scars make him a man of limited prospects. I want to suggest to you, Mr. Fitch, that they are the most legible record of a person's character that I have ever seen on a human body. I looked at my husband's face when I stepped off the stagecoach, and the first thing I thought was that I was looking at a man who went back. She held Fitch's gaze without giving an inch. Most men don't go back. You might ask yourself, privately, which kind you are. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. Fitch's face had done several things in rapid sequence. Surprise, then the particular anger of a man who's been outmaneuvered publicly, then something beneath that which might have been discomfort, the real kind, the kind that lives under pride and rarely sees daylight. His two ranch hands were studying the ground. Calloway had stepped back by half a step, the small retreat of a man who is reconsidering his alliances. Furthermore, Evelyn said, and her voice had picked up something, not anger exactly, but a contained heat, the kind that comes from having held something back for a long time and choosing now to stop. You implied that I came here out of desperation, that I had no better option and settled accordingly. I want to correct that impression. She stood straight, her hands at her sides. I read my husband's advertisement because it was the most honest thing I'd encountered in 3 years of widowhood. I corresponded with him for 4 months because every letter he wrote was direct and measured and treated me as a person capable of making my own decisions. I came to Red Creek because I chose to, because he was worth choosing. A pause. Not because he was the last option, because he was the right one. She stopped. The silence held. Fitch looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Gareth, and something in that look was different from anything Gareth had seen on the man's face in 8 years of difficult history. Not respect, not quite, but a kind of recognition, unwilling and grudging, like a man seeing something he'd decided wasn't there and finding he was wrong. Your debt, Gareth said quietly. The debt was real. It had nothing to do with Evelyn's speech. It was ironwork, 2 months of commissions that Fitch's operation had taken delivery of and not paid for, which was a pattern that Fitch maintained because he could, because no one in Red Creek had ever pressed him on it. 3 months of gate hardware, specialized hinges for the new barn Fitch had put up in spring. The kind of work that took time and skill and cost more than Fitch had bothered to acknowledge. You have outstanding payment, Gareth said. $64. I'd like it before the end of the week. The number was exact, and Gareth had known it precisely for 8 weeks, had not pressed it, had told himself he wouldn't press it because pressing Harlan Fitch on a debt in Red Creek was the kind of thing that created consequences. He was pressing it now. He didn't examine why. He just felt the words come out of him with the same flat certainty that Evelyn had used on the street, and he stood behind them. Fitch looked at him. The crowd was watching. The full attention of however many people had collected in the past 10 minutes on this particular section of Main Street, watching Harlan Fitch, who did not pay debts when pressed and had not been pressed in longer than most of Red Creek could remember. The calculation on Fitch's face was visible. The audience was the variable. Being seen to refuse a direct, legitimate request for payment owed, on a morning when everyone had just witnessed what they'd witnessed, was a different proposition than the usual quiet pressure of a man who expected deference and received it. He reached into his coat and removed a leather fold. He counted out bills with the controlled movements of a man managing his own anger carefully and handed them to Gareth across the space between them. 64, Fitch said. Thank you, Gareth said. Fitch held his gaze for one more second, that specific, measuring second of a man deciding whether to push. And then he looked away. He said something to Calloway in a low voice, turned, and walked back into the saloon. His ranch hands followed. Calloway stood for a moment longer, looked once at Gareth, then at Evelyn, then at the boards under his feet, and followed. The crowd on the street began, after a moment, to move again. The way crowds do when the tension that assembled them has discharged. Slowly, people finding errands they'd forgotten, conversations that needed continuing, directions they'd been meaning to go. Not all at once. Gradually. Mrs. Danner, Clara, the younger one, walked past and met Evelyn's eyes with a look that Gareth couldn't quite read, but that Evelyn received with a small nod. Old Mercer, standing in his doorway where he'd been standing since approximately the beginning of this, looked at Gareth for a long moment and then looked away at nothing in particular, in the way of a man who has seen something he needs time to think about. Gareth and Evelyn stood on the street. He looked at her. She was still facing forward, her breathing returning from wherever it had gone during those 2 minutes, her hands at her sides with the fingers slightly open, the way hands open when they've been held deliberately still. Evelyn, he said, don't. She turned and looked at him, and her face was doing something complicated, still composed on the surface, but underneath it something had moved, the way ice shifts in a thaw without breaking. Not yet. I need a minute. They walked to the hitching post at the far edge of the street without speaking. She put her hand on the rail and stood there for a moment, her back to the street, her face turned toward the line of mountains at the valley's edge. He stood beside her. He didn't say anything. He'd learned that she needed silence the way some people needed movement, and he'd learned to give it to her without making it into a question. After a while, she said, "He has no idea who you are. He's had 12 years to find out and chose not to." "I know." She was quiet again, then, "Were you angry when I stepped in?" "No." She looked at him sideways. "Maybe for a second," he said. The first second. He was honest because she'd earned it. "I've handled Fitch for 8 years. There's a part of a man that wants to—" He stopped. "But no, not after that second." "I needed to say it," she said. "It wasn't just for the crowd." "I know. I've been carrying it since the store," she said, "since Mrs. Parsons' face changed, since Clara Danner told me what people were saying. I've been carrying it, and today felt like the day it needed to go somewhere." She looked at the mountains. "I hope it didn't make things harder for you." "It didn't," he said. He thought about it for a moment, honestly, the way she'd taught him to be honest about things by being honest about them herself. "It might have made some things easier," he said. "I don't know yet." She was quiet. "The alderman boy," she said. "James? He'd be 21 now. His family moved east when he was 12. "Did they thank you?" He thought about it. "His mother did. At the time." He paused. "His father had a harder time with it. I think it was difficult for him, having a man look the way I look because of something that happened on his property." "That's—" She stopped. She pressed her lips together briefly. "That must have been very lonely." "It was what it was," he said. "Stop doing that," she said. He looked at her. "Stop saying it was what it was when you mean something cost you," she said. "You're allowed to say it cost you." "It did. Say so." He was quiet for a moment. The mountains sat at the edge of the valley in the hard, clear light. "It was lonely," he said. "Yes, it was very lonely." She nodded. She didn't say anything else about it. She didn't reach for his hand or say something meant to smooth it over. She just received it, the same way she received most hard things, directly, without deflecting it into something easier. After a while, they began walking back toward the end of the street where the forge was. The afternoon had moved on, the Saturday crowd thinning, the heat coming off the packed dirt of the main street in a way you could almost see. A dog somewhere was barking at something. The mountains held their positions. They passed Mrs. Hollis, who looked at them both and then looked specifically at Gareth and said, "Afternoon, Gareth. with a directness and a use of his given name that she had not previously employed in their dozen years of living in the same settlement. "Afternoon," he said. They kept walking. Evelyn said nothing about the exchange until they were past the forge and behind it, in the narrow space between the building and the cabin, where Fletcher was asleep on the porch with his paws crossed and one ear twitching at flies. "She used your name," Evelyn said. "She did. Has she done that before?" He thought about it. He was honest with himself about it, which took a second. "Not that I can recall," he said. Evelyn walked up the porch steps and opened the cabin door. She stopped at the threshold with her hand on the doorframe, her back to him, looking into the cool interior of the cabin. "Something shifted today," she said. Not a question. "Maybe. I know you don't want to count on it. I've been wrong about this town before," he said. "In both directions." She turned to look at him over her shoulder. Her expression was the steady one, the one that didn't ask for reassurance, but also didn't pretend things were other than they were. "So have most people," she said. "That doesn't mean today didn't happen." She went inside. Gareth stood on the porch for a moment with Fletcher waking up at his feet, the old dog stretching and then sitting and leaning companionably against his leg. Down the length of the valley, the afternoon light was doing what afternoon light did in July in the mountains, going long and gold and a little merciless, illuminating things that shade had kept comfortable. The main street of Red Creek was visible from here in pieces, the roof lines and the hitching posts and the far edge of the saloon where Fitch had retreated. Gareth reached down and put his hand on the dog's head. Something had shifted. He could feel it the way you feel a change in weather before it arrives. Not the change itself yet, just the pressure of it, the thing in the air that tells you something is coming that will be different from what came before. He didn't count on it. He'd learned not to count on things too early. But he didn't dismiss it either. He went inside. The change didn't come all at once. That was the first thing Gareth noticed. That it wasn't a single morning where he woke up and the world had rearranged itself into something more accommodating. It was slower than that, and less clean, and had setbacks in it the way real things have setbacks. The week after the confrontation with Fitch, things were actually harder in some ways before they got better. 3 of Fitch's regular commissions didn't come in, which Gareth had expected. Fitch was not a man who accepted public embarrassment without extracting some cost from whoever had occasioned it, and pulling his business was the most direct tool available. 2 other customers followed, men whose operations were tied closely enough to Fitch's that their loyalty ran in the same direction as their livelihoods. Gareth noted the losses and adjusted his accounts and kept working, because that was the only available response. Evelyn noticed the ledger. She'd taken over the household accounts within the first month, not because he'd asked her to, but because she'd looked at his system, which was a stack of paper held under a flat iron near the window, and said that she could do it better, and then demonstrated that she could. She kept the accounts in a proper book now, columns and running totals, and she went through it each Sunday evening at the table with the particular focused attention of a woman who understands that money is not abstract. 3 regulars short this month, she said one Sunday in late July. "I know. Fitch? His or men whose business depends on his goodwill." She ran her finger down the column. "It's manageable for now, but if it continues into fall when the farm commissions slow down—" "I know," he said again. "I've run short seasons before." "I'm not panicking," she said, looking up. "I'm telling you what I see. I know the difference." She looked at him for a moment with the particular expression that meant she was deciding whether to say something further. She decided to. "Is there work we could go after, rather than wait for it to come in?" He thought about it. "There are a couple of the larger farms south of the valley that have been using a smith in the next county. The travel costs them, but they haven't had local options they preferred." "Why not?" He didn't answer immediately. "Because of me," he said finally. She received that without comment, which he appreciated. She didn't dispute it or rush to soften it, just took it as the plain fact it was. "If I rode out to the Garfield farm," he said, "showed them what I do, the quality of the work. They're practical people. They might make a different calculation." "Then ride out," she said. He did, the following Thursday. He came back with a 2-month commission for hardware and tools, a handshake from old Daniel Garfield that had more weight in it than the man's words, and the information that the Garfield daughter-in-law had asked whether the blacksmith's wife would be willing to trade preserving lessons for some of their apple harvest in fall. He told Evelyn that last part with care, watching her face. She looked at him steadily. She asked that specifically? About me? Those were the words. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. Then she said, yes. Tell her yes. The apple question turned out to matter more than he'd anticipated. Clara Danner had a sister-in-law at the Garfield farm, which meant the conversation about preserving traveled the way conversations traveled in Red Creek, thoroughly and without requiring anyone to make a particular effort. By August, 2 more women had made similar inquiries through the indirect channel of other women, and Evelyn had quietly become a resource that people were finding reasons to access, which meant they were finding reasons to come by the cabin, which meant the cabin was, for the first time since Gareth had occupied it, occasionally full of people who had chosen to be there. He came in one afternoon and found Evelyn at the table with Clara Danner and Miss Price, and a woman he didn't immediately recognize, all of them with cups and the remains of something baked, and Fletcher asleep in the corner because dogs understood when a room was safe. The conversation stopped for a beat when he came through the door. Not the old kind of stop, the discomfort stop, but the brief pause of people interrupted in the middle of something. The harness hardware you wanted, Evelyn said to Clara. Gareth, can you do a trace repair for the Danners by the end of the week? End of Thursday, he said. Clara Danner looked at him, and something in her face was different from the careful management he'd received from the town's women for years. Something more direct, less mediated by whatever category she'd stored him in before. Thank you, Gareth, she said. The name again. His given name, unforced, from a woman who'd been calling him nothing at all for 12 years, which was the polite way of avoiding the question of what to call him. He nodded and went back through to the forge. He hammered iron for 2 hours and thought about almost nothing, which was the best state he could achieve. The other change was Nora. She was still coming on Tuesdays, but by August, she'd extended her presence to other days when she had something specific she wanted to see or ask about, and her parents had apparently arrived at some accommodation with this habit because no one came to retrieve her and no one sent word that she should stop. She was in the forge when Gareth tried a new technique on a set of decorative hinges. Experimental, something he'd been thinking about for months, and she watched the entire process with the absorbed silence of a person witnessing something that interests them genuinely, not performing interest. Why the extra fold? She asked when he paused. Makes the joint stronger without adding weight, he said. Can you see it when it's done? No, but it's there. She thought about that, like how a good stitch is the one you can't see. He looked at her. Where'd you hear that? Mrs. Hale. She's right, he said. Nora picked up a piece of scrap iron from the pile he let her handle. She'd learned early what was safe to touch and what wasn't, faster than most adults learned it. She turned it in her small hands. My papa says you're the best smith in the territory. Your papa's being generous. He doesn't say things he doesn't mean, Nora said, with the complete certainty of a 7-year-old reporting on her father's character. He's not that kind of man. Gareth didn't say anything to that. He went back to the hinge and Nora put the scrap iron down and watched, and the forge was quiet except for the fire and the work. She asked him once, in September, while he was showing her how to identify iron quality by color in the heat. He'd started doing this carefully, small lessons that she'd asked for, and he'd found he didn't mind giving. She asked him without preamble, the way she asked everything. Did you ever wish you looked different? He worked the iron for a moment before answering. Yes, he said, for a long time. Do you still? He thought about it honestly, the way her direct questions always demanded honesty. Less than I used to, he said. Because of Mrs. Hale? That's part of it. What's the other part? He pulled the iron from the coals and looked at it. Getting tired of spending energy on something I can't change, he said. There's only so much of that a person has. After a while, you start thinking about where it's more usefully spent. Nora considered this with the gravity she brought to most things. My mama says that about worrying, she said. That worrying takes up room that something better could use. Your mama's not wrong. She's right about most things, Nora said. Not everything. She thought the cat was going to have 3 kittens, and it had 5. He looked at her. Nobody's right about everything, she said philosophically. He went back to work and didn't say anything because there was nothing useful to add to that. The morning in late September when things between himself and Evelyn broke open was not dramatic. That was what he remembered afterward, that it wasn't a fight Wasn't a romantic moment, wasn't any of the shapes he might have anticipated. It was a Sunday, early, the light still thin and gray, and he'd come through the main room to find her sitting at the table with her coffee already cold in front of her, and her hands folded on the table in a way that meant she'd been sitting there for a while. He checked his first instinct, which was to ask if something was wrong. He'd learned that she generally didn't sit quietly when something was wrong. She moved, she found tasks, she organized things. Sitting still in the early morning without apparent purpose was, for Evelyn, a different condition. He poured his coffee and sat down across from her. She looked at him. "Can I ask you something difficult?" "Yes." "Are you happy?" The word sat on the table between them, and he looked at it for a moment. It was not a word he had much recent history with. He'd spent 12 years organizing his life around functional rather than happy, around what was sufficient, what was sustainable, what got you from one end of a season to the other without breaking. "I don't know if I know how to answer that," he said. "Try," she said. Not unkindly, just directly. He turned his cup in his hands. "I'm better than I was," he said, "by a significant margin." He paused. "The mornings are different. The evenings are different." He was choosing words carefully because the subject required it. "I catch myself." He stopped. "What?" "I catch myself looking forward to things," he said. "Small things. The coffee. Tuesday when Nora comes." "You telling me something you noticed that I didn't?" He looked at his cup. "That's new. That hasn't been there in a long time." She was quiet for a moment. "That sounds like the beginning of happy," she said. "Maybe." He looked at her. "Are you?" She took a breath. "I want to tell you something I haven't said yet." "All right." She unfolded her hands and laid them flat on the table, palms down, the way she positioned herself when she was being precise about something. "I was afraid," she said, "when I answered your advertisement. Not of you, of being wrong again. Of choosing something because it was honest and practical, and finding out that honest and practical weren't enough. That I'd made a sensible decision and still ended up with the same kind of alone I was trying to leave." He didn't say anything. He let her have the space. "I'm not afraid of that anymore," she said. "I want you to know that." "What changed it?" She looked at him with the direct attention that he'd stopped finding startling, and now found he relied on, the way you rely on a fixed point when the ground is unsteady. "You did," she said. "Not one thing you did. Just the accumulation of you. The way you are." She paused. "The way you talked to Nora about the iron color and thought I wasn't listening. The way you went to the Garfield farm and didn't tell me you were nervous about it until 3 days later. The way you still make 2 cups of coffee even though you've never once asked whether I want some, because you already know I do." She stopped. "The way you said it was lonely instead of it was what it was. That one time, because I asked you to." He was quiet for a long moment. The cabin made its small sounds around them, the stove ticking, the early wind at the window, Fletcher shifting somewhere behind him. "I need to tell you something too," he said. She waited. He looked at the table, then made himself look at her, the left side of his face and all, the way he'd learned to do with her specifically because she'd never given him any reason to manage it. "I've been afraid," he said, "since about the 3rd week, that you'd arrive at a point where the arithmetic of this changed, where what you'd signed on for didn't match what you actually had, and you'd—" He stopped. "I've been waiting for it," he said, "watching for it. Every time something went wrong, the Fitch business, the lost commissions, the way certain people in this town still look at me. I'd watch your face to see if it was the thing that shifted your calculation. And I've never seen it shift," he said, "which I don't entirely know what to do with." She looked at him for a moment, and then she said, "Gareth, I'm not here because the calculation worked out. The calculation worked out because I was already here, and I was already here because of who you are." She paused. "I need you to let go of the arithmetic. It's not what this is." He looked at her. "You've spent 12 years believing that you were a problem people were solving," she said. "An accommodation. Something to be managed from a careful distance." Her voice was even, but underneath it was something with force to it. "You are not a problem I'm solving. You are a person I chose. There's a difference, and I need you to understand it." The thing that happened in his chest when she said that was something he didn't have good language for. It wasn't relief exactly, or not only relief. It was the feeling of a weight that you've carried for so long you stopped being aware it was weight, suddenly set down, and the surprise of being lighter than you remembered knowing how to be. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "I'm not good at this," he said, at the receiving part of things people say. "I know," she said. "You're getting better at it. You're sure about that?" "I'm sure," she said. "I notice these things." He looked at her across the table in the gray, early light. This woman who'd come off a stagecoach 5 months ago and shaken his hand without flinching and rearranged his kitchen shelves and taken on Harlan Fitch on a main street in July and put out a small cup every Tuesday afternoon and told him, last night before they slept, that the mountain bluebirds would be back in May because she'd already decided she was staying long enough to see them. "Thank you," he said, "for what you said to Fitch." She looked at him. "I said it because it was true." "I know, thank you anyway." She nodded once. She picked up her cold coffee and looked at it. "This is terrible," she said. "I'll make fresh." "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to." He got up. "I want to." She let him. That was new too. She was getting better at letting him do things not because they were necessary, but because he wanted to, which had taken her a few months to allow. The way it takes some people time to understand that accepting something offered isn't the same as owing a debt for it. He stood at the stove and made fresh coffee while she sat at the table in the thin early light. And Fletcher came and put his head on her knee, and outside the valley was doing what it did in late September, going gold at the edges, the aspens on the upper slopes turning in a way that made the mountains look like they were lit from inside. October brought the first real cold, and with the cold came Reverend Dawes to the forge on a Thursday morning, which was unusual enough that Gareth marked it. Dawes was a mild man, not by nature, but by practice. He'd made himself mild over years of ministering to a frontier congregation that had strong opinions about most things and didn't take interference kindly. He came in with his hat in his hands and stood in the forge doorway until Gareth looked up. "Reverend." "Gareth." Dawes looked at the floor, then up. "I've been meaning to come by." Gareth set his work down and waited. "I owe you an apology," Dawes said, and from the sound of it the words had cost him something to assemble. "I've been thinking on it since July, since the business with Fitch on the street." He paused. "I was there. I was standing near the dry goods when it happened, and I watched, and I said nothing." He pressed his lips together. "I should have said something, on your behalf, or Mrs. Hale's, before she had to say it herself. It would have been the right thing, and I didn't do it." Gareth looked at him for a moment. He was aware that this was not a small thing for Dawes. The man was not built for direct admission. It was visibly uncomfortable, and he'd come to do it anyway. "I appreciate that," Gareth said. "It won't happen again," Dawes said. "That's all I came to say." He put his hat on and left. Gareth stood for a moment with the unworked iron in his tongs, and the fire doing what fires do, and the quiet of the forge around him that was suddenly a different quality of quiet than it had been for a long time. He put the iron back to the heat. He thought about what Evelyn had said that morning at the table. "I noticed these things, the small accumulating evidence of a world that was, however slowly and imperfectly and with setbacks in it, beginning to see him differently." He thought about Nora Bell saying, "My papa says you're the best smith in the territory without any weight on it except the simple transmission of a fact." He thought about Mrs. Hollis saying his name, about Clara Danner at the table in his kitchen, about Dawes standing in the doorway with his hat in his hands and the words costing him something. He worked the iron. He shaped the hinge he was making, a good one, better than it needed to be the way his work was often better than it strictly needed to be, because that was the standard he'd set himself before anyone in Red Creek had formed a single opinion of him, and it was the standard he intended to maintain regardless of what they thought. He stopped hiding the left side of his face that afternoon. He hadn't made a decision about it, hadn't planned it. He simply noticed, around 2 o'clock, that he was standing in the open forge doorway angled toward the street, the left side out, the scarred side visible to anyone on the main street who looked, and that he'd been standing that way for about 20 minutes without having thought about it. He straightened up and kept working. Nobody came by to point it out. The afternoon went on. The October light came down the valley in long, slanted angles that made the dust in the forge doorway look like something worth painting, and the mountains held their positions at the valley's edge. And Red Creek went about its business in the muted way of a town settling into autumn, and Gareth Hale stood in the doorway of the forge he'd built his life in, the scarred side of his face toward the street, and hammered iron in the light. Winter came to Red Creek the way it always did, without asking permission and without particular concern for anyone's readiness. By November, the passes were threatening snow, and by December they delivered on the threat comprehensively, the valley locked in under a sky that had forgotten what blue looked like, the mountains invisible behind cloud for days at a stretch. It was a different winter than the one before it. That was the thing Gareth kept noticing, not dramatically, not in any single moment, but in the texture of the days. Last winter, he'd sat alone at the table in the evenings with the cold pressing at the window glass and the silence of a man who has accepted that silence is what he gets. This winter, the lamp was on and there was someone across the table. And sometimes the someone was reading, and sometimes she was mending, and sometimes she was telling him something she'd heard from Clara Danner that week. And sometimes they didn't talk at all, just occupied the same space with the ease of two people who had stopped needing to perform comfort for each other and had arrived at the actual thing. He'd stopped waiting for the arithmetic to change. It had taken longer than he'd have liked to admit. The letting go of it. The unlearning of the particular vigilance that 12 years of managed distance had built into him. But Evelyn had been patient with it in the way she was patient with things she understood. Not gentle exactly, not soft, but steady. When she saw him watching her face for the shift he was always anticipating, she'd just hold his eyes until he stopped, until whatever he'd been bracing for passed through him without finding anything to attach to. He was getting better at receiving things. He told her that once in January, not as a milestone, but just as an observation, the way you observe that the light is different in February than it was in December. She'd said, "I know, I live with you." He'd said, "That's a strange thing to be proud of." She'd said, "Is it?" and gone back to what she was reading, and that had been the end of it, which was exactly the right end for it. Nora Bell turned 8 in February. She told Gareth this fact approximately 3 weeks in advance, not requesting anything, just informing him, the way she informed him of most things she considered relevant. He spent 2 of those 3 weeks thinking about it, and 1 week actually making the thing he'd decided to make, a small iron horse, not the cheap tin kind that broke at the leg joint, but real iron, worked carefully, with the proportions right, and the legs properly weighted, and a small flowing suggestion of a mane that had taken him 3 attempts to get to look like what it was supposed to look like, rather than a ridge of cooling metal that could be anything. He was not a man who made decorative things often. His work was functional. Hardware, tools, the practical ironwork of a working frontier settlement. But he knew how to make things well, and he knew how to look at something until he understood its shape. And the horse that came out of the 3rd attempt was, he thought without excessive pride, a genuinely good piece of work, small enough to hold in a child's palm, heavy enough to feel like something real, the surface finished to a dark, even color that would hold for years without rusting if she kept it dry. He gave it to her on a Tuesday, because that was when she came. She held it in both hands and looked at it for a long time without speaking, which was unusual for Nora, who generally had words for everything. "It's iron," she said finally. "It is." "Like you make." "The same iron, yes." She turned it carefully, examining the legs, the proportions, the mane. "It won't break like the other one." "It shouldn't break," he said. "If it does, I made it wrong." She looked up at him. "Did you make it for me specifically, or did you have it and give it to me?" "I made it for you specifically," he said. She looked back at the horse. Her face was doing something that he recognized as a child managing a feeling larger than she had good vocabulary for. She pressed her lips together briefly. "Thank you," she said. Then, "I'm going to keep it forever." "That's longer than I can promise the iron will last," he said. "It'll last," she said, with the certainty of a child who has decided a thing is true. "I'll take care of it." He believed her. She carried it home that evening, cupped in both hands, carefully, the way you carry something you've decided matters. Evelyn had watched the exchange from the cabin doorway without interfering. Later, when Nora was gone and the evening had settled around them, she said, "That was a beautiful thing you did." "It's just iron," he said. "Stop that," she said, but not unkindly. He stopped. Spring arrived in its usual tentative fashion, testing the valley with a few warm days and then withdrawing for another round of cold before finally committing, sometime in mid-April, to the business of actually being spring. The bluebirds returned to the Eve on the 18th, which Gareth noted because Evelyn had said she would be there to see them return, and she was, standing at the kitchen window with her coffee in both hands, and the particular stillness she had when she was paying attention to something she'd been looking forward to. He stood slightly behind her and watched the birds. "You knew they'd come back," she said. "They always come back to the same Eve," he said. 12 years running." "That's fidelity," she said. "Or habit," he said. "Sometimes those are the same thing." She watched the pair of birds working at the nesting material they'd found. "I wrote to my mother," she said without transition. "I know. Clara mentioned she'd helped you find the paper. I told her I was well, that the winter was hard, but the cabin is warm and the work is good." She paused. "I told her I'd been right about coming here." He looked at her profile. "Was she skeptical? When you told her you were going?" "Profoundly." A small sound that was not quite a laugh. "She thought I'd lost my reason. She thought I was running away from something rather than toward something." Evelyn turned the cup in her hands. She wasn't entirely wrong. There was some running away in it, but there was more running toward than she understood. Does she understand it now? "She will when she reads this letter," Evelyn said. "I wasn't indirect about it." "You're never indirect about anything," he said. "That's not true," she said. "I'm indirect about things I haven't decided yet. Once I've decided, yes, direct." She turned to look at him. "Your coffee is going cold." He picked up his cup from the windowsill where he'd set it and drank the cold coffee without comment. The second year in Red Creek was different from the first in ways that were harder to catalog because they were smaller. Not the dramatic shift of that Saturday in July with Fitch on the main street, not the open break of the Sunday morning conversation at the kitchen table. Smaller than those things and in some ways more consequential, because they accumulated without announcement, and you only noticed them when you looked back. Tom Parson, not Mrs. Parson, who had always been the more socially forward of the two, but Tom, the quiet one who ran the accounts, and stocked the shelves, and generally let his wife navigate the human terrain of the general store, came to the Forge in May with a commission for a set of display hooks for the store's interior. He'd never brought work to Gareth directly before. He'd always sent it through his wife, or had her mention it when Gareth came in for supplies. He came himself, hat in hand, explained what he needed with the slightly stiff manner of a man executing a decision he'd made deliberately rather than automatically, and then said, "I want them done well. I know you do good work. I should have said that before." Gareth didn't make a thing of it. He took the commission, agreed on a price, agreed on a timeline, and let the man go. But he thought about it afterward. About the particular cost of that sentence for Tom Parson, who was not a man accustomed to saying things he should have said before. Some people would have dismissed it as too small, too late, not enough. Gareth found he couldn't dismiss it. He understood what it cost a person to say a thing like that. He understood it from the inside, from all the years of managing what he wanted to say and what came out instead. He made the hooks carefully, better than Tom Parson had probably expected. When the man came to collect them and saw the quality of the work, something shifted in his face. Not surprise exactly, more like the confirmation of something he'd suspected and hadn't let himself act on before now. "I'll send people to you," Tom Parson said. "People who ask me where to go for ironwork. I'll send them here." "I appreciate that," Gareth said. Tom Parson nodded and left with his hooks, and that was the extent of it, and it was enough. By summer of the second year, the forge had more work than it had seen in years. Some of it was organic. The valley was growing, new families coming in, new farms being established to the north and east, and a growing settlement needs ironwork the way it needs water. But some of it was the other kind, the kind that comes from a reputation that's been quietly revised, from people who had reconsidered what they thought they knew and arrived at a different conclusion. Gareth hired a boy for the summer, young Will Greer, 16, the son of a farmer 2 miles south who had some aptitude and more willingness than aptitude, and showed up every morning without being reminded and left every evening without being pushed, which were the two qualities Gareth valued most in an assistant. He was awkward around the work at first and awkward around Gareth's face at first. But the first awkwardness went away with practice, and the second went away faster than Gareth had expected, around the third week, when Will apparently decided that the face was just the face and there were more interesting things to pay attention to, like whether he was doing the hammer technique correctly. He wasn't, for the first 2 weeks. He got there eventually. Nora came by the forge one afternoon in August and found Will there and assessed him with the thorough attention she brought to new elements in her environment. "You're new," she told him. "Started in June," Will said. "You hold the tongs wrong," she said. Will looked at his tongs, then at Gareth. "She's right," Gareth said. Will adjusted his grip. Nora watched with the expression of a child who has been proven correct and is not making a production of it, but is noting it internally for future reference. "She comes a lot?" Will asked Gareth later, after Nora had gone. "Most weeks," Gareth said. "She's particular," Will said. "She is," Gareth agreed. "She knows a lot about ironwork for a kid." "She's been paying attention for 2 years," Gareth said. "Attention over time will do that." Will thought about this. "She gonna be a smith?" "I have no idea," Gareth said. "She's 8. She might be anything." He came home that evening and found Evelyn in the garden, which was in its full August abundance now, a fact that still surprised him every time he walked around the corner and saw it. How different it looked from the functional but sparse rows he'd maintained for years. How it had become something that grew with actual intention. She was harvesting beans, moving along the row with the practiced efficiency he'd come to recognize as her signature in everything she did. "There's a letter," she said, without looking up, "on the table from Nebraska." He went inside and found it. The handwriting on the outside was not Evelyn's mother's hand. He'd seen that on the return letters. But something different. He opened it. It was from Evelyn's sister in St. Louis. 3 pages, close written, and the tone of it was different from what he might have expected based on what Evelyn had said about her family's skepticism. Somewhere in the second page, the sister wrote that she was glad Evelyn sounded well, and that she'd like to visit if the offer was open and the journey manageable, because the letters Evelyn had sent over the past year had made the place sound like somewhere worth seeing. He brought the letter outside and handed it to Evelyn, who read it with her hand still dirt brown from the garden. She read it twice, the way she read things that required more than one pass. "She wants to come," Evelyn said. "I can see that." Evelyn looked at the letter and then at the garden, and then at the cabin and the forge behind it, taking in the whole of the thing, the way you take in something you've built and are seeing through someone else's eyes for a moment. "What do you think?" she asked. "It's your sister," he said. "If you want her to come, she should come." "I'm asking what you think, not giving you permission to defer," she said. He almost smiled. He'd learned to recognize when she was doing that, catching him in the habit of stepping back from his own opinion, and he'd learned that the right response was to actually produce the opinion rather than continue the dodge. "I think it would be good for you," he said, "to have someone from before here, to have her see this." He paused. "I think I'd be nervous about it." "Why nervous?" "Because she'll have a view of me formed before she arrives, and those views are hard to revise." Evelyn looked at him steadily. "You revised an entire town's view," she said. "A sister is one person." "The town had 2 years," he said, "and you helped." "I'll help with this too," she said, "if it needs helping." He looked at her in the August light, dirt on her hands and a strand of hair loose from its pin where she'd pushed it back. Not beautiful in the way that required maintenance, but in the way that didn't. The way of a person who looks like themselves without effort, and whose face you've come to know so well that you stop seeing it as a thing to evaluate, and start seeing it as just the face, the actual face, the one that belongs to the person. "Right back to her," he said. "Tell her she's welcome." The sister, her name was Ruth, came in October. She was 5 years younger than Evelyn, livelier in manner, quicker to laugh, with the same directness of gaze but applied differently, like the same quality of light through a different window. She arrived on the Tuesday coach with 2 bags, and the wary energy of a woman steeling herself for something and trying not to show that she's doing it. She shook Gareth's hand at the stage stop and held the handshake a beat longer than was strictly necessary, looking at his face in the direct way of a person who has decided to look and not perform, not looking. He let her look. He'd stopped managing it with most people. Evelyn had taken that habit apart piece by piece over 2 years, not intentionally, just by consistently looking at him the same way regardless, until the bracing he did before meeting anyone's eyes had lost its reason to exist. "Evelyn wrote about you," Ruth said. Good things, I hope, he said, because it was the expected response. Honest things, she said, which I prefer. He recognized that preference. He'd recognized it in the family. She stayed 2 weeks. She helped in the garden and sat at the kitchen table with Evelyn in the evenings and went with them both to Sunday service, where she watched the congregation with the bright, calibrating attention of a newcomer assessing what she'd been told against what she could see. She met Nora Bell on a Tuesday and assessed the child with approximately the same attention the child assessed her with. On the 9th day, while Evelyn was at the schoolhouse helping Miss Price and Gareth was working in the forge, Ruth appeared in the doorway. He looked up. She came in and sat on the stool, Nora's stool, which he'd started thinking of as Nora's stool, and looked at the work he was doing without asking what it was. He let the silence be what it was and kept working. I owe you an apology, she said eventually. You don't know me well enough to owe me anything, he said. I formed an opinion of you before I arrived, she said. A low one. I thought my sister had made a desperate decision, and I was prepared to find evidence of that. She paused. I haven't found it. I know what you were looking for, he said. I thought you might. He worked the iron. The fire was steady, the morning light coming through the forge opening at a low angle. She's not desperate, he said. She never was. She's the most deliberate person I've ever encountered. I know that, Ruth said. She's been that way since she was 12. A pause. She's also happier than she was. I didn't tell her that yet, but she is. He stopped working for a moment, put the iron back to the coals. I'm glad, he said, and then, because it was true and he'd been trying to say true things, I'm working on deserving it. Ruth looked at him. She doesn't think it's something you earn, she said. I know, he said. I'm trying to learn to agree with her. Ruth left at the end of the second week with her 2 bags and the slightly altered expression of a woman who has revised a significant opinion and is deciding what to do with the revision. At the stage stop, she embraced Evelyn for a long time, the real kind of embrace, and then she looked at Gareth and put her hand briefly on his arm. Take care of each other, she said. We're working on it, Evelyn said. Ruth laughed, surprised, real, and climbed into the coach, and they watched it go until the dust settled on the northern road. Evelyn put her hand through his arm as they walked back, which she didn't always do, and he didn't take for granted when she did. She liked you, Evelyn said. She revised her opinion of me, he said. That's not the same thing. For Ruth it is, Evelyn said. She doesn't revise lightly. He thought about that. That's a family trait, he said. It is, she agreed. The years that followed were not without difficulty. They wouldn't have been honest years if they had been. There were seasons when the work was short and the accounts were lean, and the 2 of them sat at the table with the ledger and made decisions without blaming each other for the circumstances, which was harder than it sounded, and which they didn't always manage without friction. There were winters when the cold was brutal enough to be its own kind of grief, when the valley locked down for weeks and the isolation pressed at the edges of things. There was a spring when Evelyn was sick for a month, nothing mortal, but bad enough that Gareth sat by her in the evenings with a helplessness he didn't have good tools for, because his tools were iron and fire, and those were not what the situation required. He learned to be useful in other ways. He was a slow learner about that, but he learned. There was the evening, 3 years in, when Gareth came inside and found Evelyn sitting at the table crying, quietly, without drama, the kind of crying that happens when something has been held for a long time and finally lets go. He sat down across from her and didn't say anything and didn't reach across the table and didn't ask if she was all right, because she clearly wasn't all right, and asking would have been for him rather than for her. He just sat there, present, in the room, until she was done. She looked up eventually and said, I was thinking about Charles. Okay, he said. Not the way you might think, she said. Not missing him. Missing the years I spent being smaller than I was because I thought that was what was required. She pressed the back of her hand against her eyes. I'm angry about it sometimes. Not at him, just at the time. That's fair, he said. I don't always want to be philosophical about it, she said. You don't have to be, he said. She looked at him. You're better at sitting with hard things than you used to be. I had a good teacher, he said. She made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and still crying, and he got up and made coffee, because that was what he could do, and it was not nothing. And she let him, because she'd learned to let him do things for her without it meaning she couldn't do them herself. Harlan Fitch died in the winter of the 4th year. Not dramatically, not in a way that required any particular response from anyone. His heart, which had been discussed at some point as a concern, finally insisted on being taken seriously. The funeral was attended by most of the valley, the way funerals in small places are attended regardless of how the deceased is regarded, because a funeral is its own kind of communal event. Gareth went. Evelyn went beside him. He stood at the back with his hat in his hands and looked at the box and thought about the man with a complicated honesty. Fitch had been a bully and a man of real limitations in terms of who he was willing to see as worth seeing, and those things were true. And he'd also been a person who'd built something substantial from hard work and had presumably loved his family and had probably been, in some accounting, capable of better than he'd frequently chosen. Most people were capable of better than they frequently chose. Gareth had come to believe that without making it into an excuse for the choosing. He didn't grieve Fitch, but he didn't feel what he might have once expected to feel, standing at the man's funeral. No satisfaction, no weight lifted, just the neutral fact of a man who was gone and the valley that would continue without him, and the awareness that the thing Fitch had tried to damage had not been damaged. Walking home, Evelyn said, "Are you all right?" "Yes," he said, and meant it. "He doesn't get to be the last word," she said. "He wasn't when he was alive, and he isn't now." "I know," Gareth said. "He stopped being the last word a long time ago." She looked at him. "July," he said. "The Saturday in July. You took it away from him, and I don't think he ever got it back." She was quiet for a moment, then, "I wasn't trying to take anything. I was just saying what was true." "I know," he said. "That's why it worked." Nora Bell grew up in the years that followed, the way children do. Suddenly and in stages, not smoothly, with periods of being one thing and then without announcement being something else. She came to the forge less as she got older, because she had school and then more of school, because Miss Price recognized an intelligence that needed more than Red Creek's one-room schoolhouse could fully provide, and began supplementing her education with books ordered from the East and lessons conducted after hours. Nora absorbed these with the same devoted attention she'd brought to watching ironwork in a forge at age 7. She was 12 when she told Gareth she wanted to be an engineer. She said it the same way she said everything, without preamble, factually, watching to see how he received it. "Bridges?" he said. "Buildings?" "Machines," she said. "Engines. The way things move." She paused. "You taught me that things that look simple aren't, that there's more holding something together than you can see." She glanced at the iron horse on the shelf in the corner of the forge. She'd brought it back to show him once, years ago, still intact, still dark and even-surfaced, as he'd said it would be. "A good joint is invisible," she said. "You told me that." "I did," he said. "That's engineering," she said, "making the strength invisible." He looked at her. This girl who'd appeared at his forge doorway at 7 with a broken tin horse, and who'd sat on a stool for years watching iron become what he needed it to become, who'd asked questions that cut straight to the thing without the social padding that adults wrapped around their questions. "You'll be good at it," he said. "I know," she said, without arrogance, just the matter-of-fact certainty of a person who has assessed her own abilities carefully. "But I wanted to tell you." "Why?" She was quiet for a moment, which was unusual. When Nora was quiet, it meant she was choosing words rather than having them already. "Because you're one of the reasons I think I can," she said. "You showed me that the most important part of a thing is often the part that people miss because they're looking at the surface." She glanced at his face, not the old glance, not assessing, just the glance of someone looking at a person they know. "People looked at your face and stopped looking. You looked at iron and kept looking until you understood it completely." She paused. "I want to be that kind of person, who keeps looking." He was quiet for a moment. "You already are," he said. She left for school in the East when she was 16, a program in Pittsburgh that Miss Price had identified and applied for on her behalf without telling her until the acceptance came, which was the kind of strategic action that Miss Price was quietly very good at. She came to the forge the afternoon before the stagecoach and stood in the doorway with the iron horse in her hand. "I'm taking it with me," she said. "I know it's yours, but I'm taking it." "It was never mine," he said. "I made it for you." She crossed the forge and put her arms around him briefly, the hug of a child grown into a young person, slightly awkward with height and feeling, quick, real. Then she stepped back and held up the iron horse. "I'll tell people what it is," she said. "When they ask." "What will you tell them?" "That a blacksmith in Wyoming made it," she said. "That he went back twice when most people would have stopped at once. And that he taught me the important part of a thing is often the part you can't see." She left the next morning. Evelyn watched the coach go from beside Gareth, her hand through his arm, and was quiet for a long time. "She'll do remarkable things," Evelyn said. "I think so," he said. "She already has," Evelyn said, "just by being who she is." He looked at his wife, at the gray that had come into her dark hair over the years, at the lines that had settled around her eyes from squinting in the valley light and from years of the particular expression she made when she was thinking about something hard, at the face that was as known to him now as his own hands. And he thought about what it meant to have been chosen by this person, this specific and unsparing and steady person who had read a brutally honest advertisement in a newspaper and followed honesty when she found it. He thought about what he'd believed that first winter, writing 17 versions of that advertisement by candlelight. That silence was the answer he already knew was coming. That the empty chair across the table was his permanent condition. That the man everyone needed but no one wanted was the whole of the story. He'd been wrong about what the story was, about where it was going. He'd been wrong, and being wrong had been the best thing that ever happened to him. And he understood now that the willingness to be wrong, to send the letter, to stand at the stage stop, to say the true thing instead of the safe thing, to let someone in when every year of your history is telling you to brace for the cost. That willingness is not weakness. It is the only kind of courage that matters in the long run, because it's the kind you have to choose every day, without knowing in advance whether it will be returned. The valley was doing what it did in late October. The aspens gone gold and beginning to let go, the mountains showing their first new snow at the peaks, the air with that particular clarity that comes before the cold really settles in. The forge was going behind them. The eave where the bluebirds nested was empty for the season, but they'd be back. They were always back. Evelyn leaned slightly into his arm. "The hinge commission for the Garfield barn," she said. "Monday," he said. "Will wants to do the preliminary shaping himself," she said. "He told me this morning." "He's ready for it," Gareth said. "I know," she said. "I told him so." They walked back along the main street of Red Creek, past the general store where Tom Parson was sweeping the front step and lifted a hand in greeting as they passed, past the schoolhouse where Miss Price's voice could be heard through the open window running through a geography lesson, past the saloon and the post office, and all the buildings of a small place that had changed slowly and imperfectly, and not all at once, the way real things change. People greeted him. Not all of them, not every time, not without the occasional reminder that some habits are dug in too deep to be fully rerouted. But enough. Enough that the walk down the main street of the place he'd built his life was no longer something he managed. Enough that he walked with his hat on and the left side of his face toward whoever was there and thought about what needed doing at the forge rather than about how he was being seen. The town had not become a perfect place. He'd stopped expecting it to become one. The things that made people small. Fear of the unfamiliar, the comfort of agreed-upon categories, the ease of a story that doesn't require revision. Those things didn't disappear because one woman had stood on a street in July and said what was true. They diminished. They lost ground slowly, in the way that real change always loses and gains ground, the way a tide works, not linear but cumulative, advancing more than it retreats over time. That was enough. More than he'd expected 12 years ago, standing in the forge doorway with his hand on an ugly, good-natured hound, watching the empty road. He went home. He put coffee on. Evelyn sat at the table with the accounts, running her finger down the column in the familiar way. And the stove did what stoves do in October when you've learned to manage the draft and east wind. And Fletcher's replacement, a younger dog, brown and indeterminate and devoted, who they'd been calling Fletcher the Second, until the name wore away to just Fletcher, because all dogs were Fletcher. in this house now, slept by the stove. Outside, the valley held its shape in the late afternoon light, the mountains at either end of it doing what mountains do, which is simply to be there, unchanged and enormous and indifferent, outlasting every story told in their shadow. Inside, the lamp was on. There was someone across the table. That was the whole of it. That was what he'd been writing 17 letters to ask for, what he'd stood at the stage stop to receive, what 12 years of managed distance had made him doubt was available to him. He looked at the lamp. He looked at Evelyn. He picked up his coffee. The story didn't have an ending because the good ones don't. They just keep going, ordinary and sufficient and real, day by day and winter by winter. The kind of life that doesn't look like much from the outside but holds, the way good ironwork holds. Not because it's perfect, but because someone made it with care and went back twice when they didn't have to and learned, slowly and without fanfare, how to stay.